Hello, everybody. This is the Foreign Press Association of the USA in New York, and today we have an important and timely press conference with Nadia Hijab from Ashabaka, Zaha Hassan from the Carnegie Endowment. We're discussing the recent paper produced by Shabaka, Reviving a Palestinian Power, which is timely because no one's quite sure where the Palestinian power is at the moment. We have the occupiers throwing people out of their homes in the internationally recognized city of Jerusalem. The internationally recognized as occupied territory at the moment. We have missiles flying overhead, and we have Western capitals rushing to condemn the Hamas and seeming to overlook the events that set this whole thing in motion. And furthermore, we have the sad spectacle of a Palestinian president past his sell-by date who's just refused elections not refused, but made a stand of not taking elections, which he would almost certainly lose. So the study is about the fairly intensive network, which those of us who've studied the Middle East and foreign affairs know about, the Palestinian diplomatic network of embassies and envoys across the world. And it may be a surprise to some people to know that all through these years, many of these embassies and emissaries have had full diplomatic credentials issued. The British government recognized the PLO people in London. Washington blew hot and cold about it. In many countries, they're accepted as full ambassadors, and they have been a focus for the Palestinian diaspora and also a focus for influencing public opinion in those countries. The theme of the paper, as I've read it, and we have the authors here to explain it in more detail, is that they have somewhat been failing in their duties. And one of the difficulties, which we hope will come out today, is question of just who do they represent, because the Palestinian Authority, as set up by Oslo, is a local government, which many Palestinians see as enforcing Israeli occupation rules. We have the PLO, which was originally set up these missions, the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was her aim was to represent the Palestinian people wherever they were, inside the territories, outside the territories, and in the diaspora. And we have Palestine as a sort of virtual entity accepted by the United Nations and many countries as the state. So it's a bit like the nature of the Trinity. It's very difficult to pin it down. Maybe our resident theologians, Nadia and Zaha, will be able to explain it a little further. But if you've got experience studying the Trinity, let us know quickly, people, because it looks like it's the type of expertise we'd need. But first of all, Nadia, you've been with Ashabaka for many years now. Can you explain what the global think tank is and how it came to this, how it decided this was the issue that needed looking at this particular moment?
Thanks, Ian. Thanks very much for organizing this, and Kieran and Palestine Deep Dive as well. Yeah, that's a good question. Ashabaka was co-founded, I'm a co-founder of Ashabaka, was co-founded nearly 11 years ago now. And it came about because one day I was walking down a street in Washington, D.C. and realized we had no policy voice to represent us. And what was worse is that there was a policy voice that did not speak to our rights, but was taking positions that were actually inimical to our rights. So we co-founded this organization, which has grown and grown, and now has nearly 200 members. And Zaha Hassan, in addition to being with the Carnegie Endowment, is also a member of Ashabaka, a policy member of Ashabaka, which I'm very happy and to have her with us. And in fact, as I say, we have about 200 members all over the globe. So what Ashabaka does is it transforms what is a Palestinian weakness into a strength, because since we're spread all over, we can get together and analyze our situation, come up with recommendations together. And we can talk a bit more about the paper that we've just put out, just launched recently as we go along.
Okay, Zaha, do you want to chip in?
I'll just say that, I've been a fan of El Shabakah's for quite some time, and I was very pleased to become a member of the organization. Like Nadia, I work in DC, so I've been very frustrated through the course of my time here working in various think tanks, and recognizing that, yes, the Palestinian voice is very much absent or suppressed and marginalized in Washington, D.C. spaces, particularly the policy-making spaces. So the need for El Shabakah was really acute, and it really filled a void. We're starting now to see in think tanks in DC a really questioning of sort of the orthodoxy around the U.S. policy approach towards Israel-Palestine, and I'm really proud that Carnegie is in the forefront in that effort, and just released a paper called Breaking the Status Quo, which focuses on a rights-based approach to Israel-Palestine peacemaking, and tries to recenter international law and people in how we think about U.S. policy towards the region. So absolutely, I agree with Nadia. This has been a major problem in that DC has always looked at this issue from a lens of like the U.S.-Israel special relationship. So we're just starting to see that orthodoxy be questioned now.
Can you, one of you, explain what it is your paper is saying? That's broad brushstrokes. What you're saying needs to happen to the diplomatic network of the Palestinian state entity organization.
Well, the idea for this particular paper came about some time ago, in fact, and it's turns out to be extremely topical and timely now. What we identified was, okay, the PLO is in disarray. The Palestinian people have been carved up in tiny sort of allotments in the West Bank under Israeli occupation, and hounded and harassed in Jerusalem, and having second-class status as Palestinian citizens of Israel and as refugees and diaspora all over the world. So what's happened to our leadership? It's been also fragmented. We have the PA, as you said earlier, Ian, that is supposed to be representing the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, preparatory to building a state. I mean, and then it was only supposed to be around for about 5 or 6 years. And after that, there was supposed to be a Palestinian state. Instead, we've seen continued Israeli colonization of the territories. So we thought, what can we do to, where is there a part of the Palestinian leadership that still is accessible to Palestinians, or especially that is accessible to diaspora Palestinians, which themselves account for about half the Palestinian people. And we came up with the realization that the PLO diplomatic corps is still functioning. As you said, it's got offices in several countries, as Zaha said. And it's still functioning, and it could be a point of entry for the Palestinian diaspora to access and begin to reclaim agency in the Palestinian national movement, and also find ways to revive and repurpose the Palestinian national movement to actually bring about Palestinian human rights, all of them, not just a sort of segmented, fractured portion of them. And to do so, they could, work perhaps with the diplomatic corps. So that's why we wanted to discuss the diplomatic corps, because it is the most accessible, visible body for Palestinians in the diaspora. Zaha, I don't know if you wanted to add to that.
I would just add a little to that in saying that, you know, we focus in this study in particular on countries where Palestinians have more freedom of action, liberal democracies where Palestinian diaspora communities can press their governments to take action on Palestine. They can, impact the public discourse around Palestine, because we think those are key places in which the potential of the Palestinian diaspora is not being tapped into by the PLO. And in the past, the PLO was established by diaspora exiles, refugees, and that's its strength, was the fact that it could represent people all over the globe who then could access their host countries, their adopted countries, what have you, to advocate for the Palestinian cause. And with the breakdown in the relationship between the diaspora and the PLO, you've seen a breakdown in the connectivity between the diaspora and the diplomatic corps, so that this can't happen effectively anymore. Now, of course, advocacy is happening. Palestinian diaspora communities are taking the initiative on their own. But what we're arguing in the paper is that there could be so much more effectiveness if the messaging coming from the Palestinian leadership was the same as the messaging coming from the diaspora community, and there was some kind of clear objective that could drive the conversation. But right now, the messaging from the leadership is very different than the messaging in many diaspora communities. And so there's a disconnect and an undermining of the efficacy of the Palestinian diaspora.
I think it's time for Kieran to come in. Kieran, I can't remember whether I introduced him, is a board member of the Foreign Press Association and also a producer on Palestine Deep Dive, a regular interview podcast that has spoken to many Palestinian figures and people who have been concerned in the region, and Israeli figures, come to think of it. So Kieran, it's your turn to come in with your questions and perhaps to relay some of the ones that are coming in from attendees.
Thank you very much, Ian. And yeah, I read this report thinking at the end of it, but I'm going to be quite optimistic because you give so many good recommendations of what could be done, what should be done. But you decided to frame it originally around 3 events or topics over the last decade. Can you just sort of unravel a little bit the basis of your kind of methodology?
Sure. Yeah. Shall I go, Zaha? We had to zero in, for the rigor of the study, so as not to be all over the place. We had to zero in on a time frame and on certain events that would show, describe the relationship between the diaspora and the diplomatic corps. And so we chose from 2000 to 2018. And the 3 events that we chose were one event that was proactive, where the Palestinian leadership or the PLO, as well as the Palestinian Authority, had a very, very clear purpose and message, which was to make Palestine a state member of the United Nations. And then we chose a second event also within that time frame up to 20. Sorry, Zaha, am I getting the time frame wrong? It's
when the Jerusalem was
Jerusalem. Yeah.
Embassy move was 2017 when it was announced.
Yeah, 2017. Yeah, the Jerusalem embassy move, and then the third event was the elections to the Palestinian National Council in 2018. So those 3 events in that decade One was proactive by the PLO and the Palestinian Authority, and everybody was on the same page. And that worked really well and got the diaspora engaged in the process because there was clarity of vision, there was clarity of action. The move of the embassy to Jerusalem was one of the times where there was very little engagement by the diaspora because it was reactive by the PLO and the Palestinian Authority, and they didn't really know what to do, it appeared, apart from simply protests. So there was not that much engagement by the diaspora. And then the elections or the representation, they weren't really elections, but the representation in the Palestinian National Council was had rather a negative effect because the outreach by the missions, the PLO missions to the diaspora was not as clear or as effective as it should have been, and it privileged certain groups that were closer, let's say, to Fatah than others, and so the reaction overall was negative. I'm sure, and we really chose those events to illustrate when good examples of engagement and rather indifferent examples of engagement and poor examples of engagement. I'm sure Zaha probably has something to add to that.
Yeah, I would just, step back a little bit and say why there was a rupture in the relationship between the PLO and the diaspora communities.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because of the fact that, with the signing of Oslo, there was a sense among the diaspora community that the PLO, whose center of gravity was always outside of historic Palestine and then moved back into into the occupied territories. But there was a sense from the diaspora that, the state building project was going to leave the refugee claims and the diaspora claims behind. And so there was this discord by that very decision of, in signing Oslo. But it also was shown to be validated by the fact that the PLO and the PA took various legislative actions and policy decisions that effectively diminished the status and the stature of the PLO legally, as I said, and as a matter of policy, and placed those powers in the Palestinian Authority. Many of the responsibilities are redundant, but the actual authority sits with the Palestinian Authority, because the Palestinian Authority is the body now that is collecting taxes, that is, the responsible party for international donor funding. So the PLO becomes drained of its resources while the PA is aggrandized. So in the view of many diaspora communities, who have no relationship to the PA, because the PA only represents the residents of the occupied territories, to them, they lost their representative when they lost the vitality of the PLO. And so when we were examining these three different events, we were trying to see whether there was still an opportunity for the diaspora to engage with the diplomatic corps, even though they have these feelings that the PLO no longer represents them. And what Nadia mentioned, that, in talking about those three events, is it shows that there is an opportunity for engagement, but there has to be, the things that she mentioned, which is clear communication, which is, the mobilization called for has to challenge the status quo, which and show Palestinian agency, which is why the statehood bid was popular, even though many diaspora Palestinians are not pro two states. They still supported that mobilization because it challenged the Israeli narrative. It showed Palestinian agency, and it was proactive. And the third thing that was important is that it had to not reaffirm the Oslo framework, because for many diaspora Palestinians, the Oslo framework is not their framework. And so as long as the diplomatic corps was acting in those ways, the diaspora would come along to support it.
Kieran, do you want to come in on the issues? There are some questions, interesting questions coming in now. You're muted, Kieran.
Sorry, David asks if you could decide what are the immediate decisions or actions you would take for peace and Israel, PLO, PA, Hamas to move towards?
Well, gosh, that's a very good question. It's also a very
I
big
think
question.
we call it. There you are.
At the moment, and I think that's what's going on at the moment shows why this study is important. The study may seem abstruse to some people, but it's really important because you have an uprising of Palestinians across the world, sort of under occupation in Israel, in Gaza, and across the world, Palestinians and their allies in the diaspora. And there's no single point that can capture this and carry it forward. So the PA, and that gets to your question, we can recommend decisions, but at the moment, the Palestinian Authority is still committed to security coordination with Israel. And, this is at a minimum to say not a good thing for a representative of a people under occupation to be collaborating with the occupying forces to keep the people under control. And so there is that challenge, and why we're able, ironically, why we can see so much going on in Jerusalem is because the Palestinian Authority has no sway in Jerusalem, and the Palestinians are directly facing the Israeli occupiers themselves. And similarly, amongst the Palestinian citizens of Israel, I mean, obviously they're citizens of Israel, they're not living under occupation, but they are Palestinians who are calling for their rights in Israel because they are treated as second-class citizens under the law, which is why now the term apartheid is being used to describe what is being done to the entire Palestinian people. And so if there had been a way of reconnecting elements of Palestinian leadership, then something could have been done to take all this energy and all this effective demonstrations that were being done by the Palestinians in Jerusalem, that were nonviolent, that were peaceful demonstrations, trying to have the right to pray, the right to move, and the right not to be evicted for the second or third or fourth time in a generation, to keep their homes.
There's one of the questions, it's almost what you're talking about is to some extent a reversal. Normally, a diplomatic corps represents a state to everywhere else, but you're trying to envisage a condition where the diplomatic corps is going to represent everywhere else in terms of the diaspora to the state, since there's no other means of communication. And one of the issues that's coming up, and I think you mentioned it earlier, Nadia, is the whole question of one or two states, that Palestinians are prepared to go along with the idea of two states, but it's without it much enthusiasm. And increasingly, like Michael Ingber here has said, that the two-state solution is long dead. Isn't it realistic for the Palestinians to demand a democratic one-state solution? And would this be part of of the diplomatic rethink if the diaspora were to make this call loudly and clearly? And to some extent, a lot of Israelis agree that if they don't allow a viable Palestinian state, then the necessary conclusion is a unitary state, not necessarily democratic from some of them, of course.
I'll jump in there. I mean, obviously the one state, two state confederation, all of that is are on the table. I mean, Palestinians right now, there isn't a majority that supports a two-state at the moment. It's and I think, you know, Palestinians, particularly the younger generation, are just looking for their human dignity, their rights respected, and not necessarily interested in so much in the shape of that state, you know, right now. But to have that really robust discussion about what the national project should be focused on, there needs to be a rebuilding of the political address of the Palestinians. And so that's why our study focuses on this very question of how can we start to have this dialogue if half the Palestinian people are not part of it, because they no longer have any connectivity to the PLO. And so that question just really underscores why we decided to you know, pursue this study question. But absolutely, I mean, you know, you ask Palestinians how much they support the two-state solution after so many decades of negotiations toward that, and after, you know, we now have 750,000 settlers that now represent like 25% of the population of the West Bank. You know, it's obviously looking less and less likely. And so we need to start thinking about alternatives, but definitely rights should be centered. And that's something that everyone agrees on as a Palestinian. The question is the strategy to get to that durable solution.
Kieran? Muted.
Jane asks, can Palestinian elections go ahead this year?
Yeah, that's a good question, especially since so much was made about the Palestinian elections, and so much preparation went into them, and so many people took them very, very seriously. There were something like, what was it, Zaha, about over 30 lists of for the elections, lists standing for the elections. There were many people, I think 93% of the people were registered to vote. And so there was a huge amount of interest in the elections, and then they were pulled. I think the disappointment amongst people is quite significant. We're not seeing it expressed at the moment. It's coming out now in support for what's going on in Jerusalem. So for the moment, the focus is on Jerusalem, and now as well as Gaza. And I don't see elections coming around anytime soon. There are not the strings are not in the hands of the people. They're still in the hands of Mahmoud Abbas, and if he decides he doesn't want elections, then there will not be elections. We would have to see a big shift or a huge amount of pressure to have elections. But I also want to say that elections are not a solution for what the Palestinians face, because let's assume you had the cleanest, best elections on the whole planet. You are still living under Israeli occupation, and the Israeli occupation controls your every move and your every day. You can't control your land, you can't control your freedom of movement, you can't control your own resources, your tax revenues, nothing. So what elections could do is maybe shift what's been sort of cemented into place as a can't move forward, can't move back, can't move sideways. They could shift that dynamic, but you still then have to deal with the Israeli occupation.
You know, I just to add on to what Nadia is saying, you know, there was always this debate about which election should come first, whether it should be the PLC, the Palestinian Legislative Council, which is the parliament for the Palestinian Authority, or should it be the PLO parliament, which, you know, oversees Palestinians everywhere. And, you know, this was Hamas's complaint, that they wanted the PLO elections first. They wanted to be brought under the umbrella of the PLO before having PLC elections. And for many people in the diaspora, that also was the priority. The priority was focusing on the PLO first and making it inclusive, and then talking about PLC elections. But you know, that's not what took place. But still, despite this, there was a lot of enthusiasm, as Nadia says, for elections. And why? Why would there be 93% of the electorate registered to vote, you know, for a situation in which you're voting for a government that would have very limited powers to actually govern you, given that it's under occupation? And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that people are just so frustrated. They're so frustrated by, you know, the fact that the PA hasn't served them well. And that the whole negotiations paradigm hasn't served them well. And you've got generations that have never voted, and you know, that are looking for an opportunity to be able to express themselves and express themselves about how they feel about their situation. I mean, these are young people that are unemployed, many of them. We've got incredibly high unemployment. So it presented that opportunity, but the discussion is going back now again to, like, okay, how do we reform and reimagine the PLO and rejuvenate it so that it can be a representative? And as Nadia says, I mean, you know, elections are difficult under occupation. Elections are even more difficult when you're talking about getting, you know, or capturing the will of people that are fragmented all over the world and living under occupation. And so that's a challenge. And that's why we don't have direct elections for the PLO. We have this antiquated proportional representation that involves, you know, canvassing the diaspora communities so that they can appoint their own representatives to the PNC. And this is something that, you know, we studied in this work that we did together. And we found that, you know, the mechanisms for bringing in new blood from the diaspora into the PNC, the Palestinian National Council, are not working. And so one of the most important things that can be done to help to, you know, have the PLO regain its vitality is to create better mechanisms to bring in new blood and better, you know, updated representation from the diaspora and actually everywhere, because even the factional representation system that the PLO has is really outdated and doesn't reflect the actual numbers of the various factions and different syndicates and things of that nature. So that whole framework needs to be updated, but in particular to capture the diaspora community's sentiments and their will, their political will. There needs to be better mechanisms at the diplomatic mission level so that you know, they can be brought in under the PLO umbrella.
One of the questions that's come up from Shazia Rafi is, could you update on the BDS movement, any moves in the US to reverse the illegality? And I'd like to broaden that out. Is, you know, one of the roles of the former diplomatic corps was to rally. I mean, I would have thought that 10 or 20 years ago, Palestinian diplomats would be swinging from the flagpoles in all the various capitals, waving the belated human rights rights determination that apartheid is being practiced there. And yet we've hardly heard it. I mean, it's as somebody pointed out in a study, I think Canadian broadcasting completely ignored the report. That they would rather cover a soccer match in Tel Aviv than they would cover a tremendous report with tremendous legal implications if it's followed, especially with the ICC determinations coming up. So, I mean, what role do you both see for the Palestinian diplomatic network in energizing and focusing the energies of the diaspora to get political results in the respective host countries?
Yeah, it's a task that the Palestinians have to undertake, both to reconnect with the representatives in the diaspora, the PLO, and also to have them hear from them, from us, as it were, what they want the representatives to do. And so, again, that's why we hope that this study would show both the diaspora ways to reach out and opportunities to reach out to their representatives, and would show the representatives opportunities to engage with the diaspora. I think to get to the question that you started with, Ian, which is about the role of the BDS movement and its position. It's not, it's outlawed in some, or it's been made illegal in some states in the United States. It's not outlawed throughout the United States. I think, correct me, Zaha, if I'm wrong. And it is actually providing a lot of guidance for Palestinian, for international civil society. So you've got Palestinians working for their rights, and you've got then the civil society in many countries, including many Jewish groups, very important and weighty Jewish groups, providing support and taking their leadership from the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, the BDS movement. So there's a lot happening in that respect on the ground, but it's not enough in and of itself to have a shift in what Israel is doing. For that, you really need leadership that pulls everyone together, has everyone with a clear message on the same page, moving forward, as was done with the state system. I want to note that the Palestinians expressed their self-determination twice. Once in the 1960s, when they said that opted for a one-state solution, when all people on the land should be free and equal in rights. And then that was the policy through the 70s. That was the PLO platform through the 70s. And 80s, and then it became exchanged for the two-state solution, which again was an expression of Palestinian self-determination. It was approved by the Palestinian National Council. I personally am agnostic. I think people can talk solutions, but the solutions are very far away. And what you really need is, how do we get from here to there? What are our sources of power? What are areas of activism? What coalitions, what relationships can we build to actually get to our rights? And the report that Ian mentioned, the Human Rights Watch report, which followed several other reports that have described Israel as an apartheid state, I think for us is a watershed moment, because it really tells things as they are. And it's, even if Canadian television prefers a soccer match, it is really something that is impossible to ignore, and it's given a point of unity for a lot of civil society organizations. Sorry, I overspoke there, but
can I just add? I love coming after Nadia because she does all the hard lifting, and then I can come in and just add my points. You know, yes, this Human Rights Watch report is a watershed moment. It will be a lost opportunity if you don't have this kind of coordination and engagement we're talking about between the diaspora and the Palestinian leadership. And I fear we're going to lose that opportunity again. And we've seen it lost so many times. It's heartbreaking for those of us in the human rights community, because we've had an International Court of Justice opinion, which was amazing in 2004, which talked about, you know, the application of international human rights law in the occupied Palestinian territories, as well as humanitarian law. And it talked about all the various ways in which Israel was violating Palestinian human rights, things that are confirmed in the Human Rights Watch report. And this was 2004. What was done with that report? How much, you know, activity was there by the Palestinian Authority or the PLO, or how much engagement was there with the diaspora to try to use that opportunity of that report to you know, do advocacy in the various capitals in which you find Palestinian diaspora communities? There was very little. Or think about the Goldstone report. What a watershed moment that was, when that report came out and talked about the you know, crimes, war crimes that Israel committed in Gaza. And we just, you know, and again, you know, not only was that not utilized, but at the very beginning of the release of that, you saw the Palestinian Authority take the position of, we don't want to talk about it right now in the Human Rights Council, right? And which caused a lot of upset, to say the least, particularly among the diaspora community. I mean, it was across the board. But
pretty much paved the way for the Israelis to to silence and humiliate Goldstone afterwards, of course.
Yeah, they left him vulnerable in that way too. But I mean, so, you know, think about whether if there was that kind of engagement, how you might have protected and empowered you know, the delegation that came out with that report, including Goldstone, who ended up becoming so marginalized because he felt so attacked. And then, you know, now we have the ICC opening up, you know, its investigation, and I fear that, you know, we're going to lose that opportunity too. Again, because we have a Palestinian Authority that's so focused on state building and so focused on trying to get in the good graces of the administration to relaunch peace talks, that it's going to impact the ICC's energy in pursuing this. So we absolutely, this is one of the clear reasons why we need to start rebuilding the PLO and reasserting it as the, you know, as the representative of the Palestinians, and making sure that all Palestinians, wherever they are, have an opportunity to impact the national project and the rethinking of the national project. And on the BDS issue, you know, I would just say, no, we don't have anything specifically that outlaws it, but we have things at the state and local level here in the United States, which, you know, try to discourage BDS, for example, by asking people that are going to sign contracts with the local government, say they're a teacher and they want to sign a contract, they have to, you know, have a loyalty oath in some states to say that they don't boycott Israel, or you don't get awarded a state contract if you assert that you support boycotts of Israel. We have these things happening in various states, and when they go up into the courts, they get overturned because it's a clear violation of a individual right for free speech and expression. At the federal level, you definitely see a lot of members of Congress, most of them, even the progressive members, that are against BDS. But we don't have yet at the federal level anything that like at the state level, where there's you know, a conditioning of contracts on your, you know, affirming that you don't engage in boycotts of Israel. But we do have a new Democratic administration that is very much opposed to boycotts of Israel, and says that, you know, very frequently those boycotts are, you know, covers for anti-Semitism. And that's very problematic, obviously, because that creates a chilling effect in the country around BDS. It impacts, you know, student efforts on campus around Israel. And it just sends a message that, you know, criticism of Israel and any kind of agency to try to challenge Israeli human rights abuses is bad. And you have the authority of the government saying that. So it's not like me saying I'm opposed to BDS or someone else saying it. You have the government saying that. So obviously that has impacts on you know, the public discourse and on you know, the way people will want to engage in the marketplace of ideas when you have something like that.
Would that be helped if the Palestine ambassador to Washington, D.C. were banging on the White House door with the White House doors with the TV cameras, taking a message to President Biden? How feasible is that type of scenario?
We don't have a PLO representative in D.C. At the moment. You recall they were booted out, you know, when the PLO refused to engage on Trump's peace plan. So we don't have the ability. And in fact, under U.S. law now, we cannot. You will not see a Palestinian official on official business in the U.S. or opening up a mission, even if the Biden administration invites the PLO back to D.C. You won't find them, you know, running to their, you know, to come back to the U.S. because we have this Anti-Terrorism Clarification Act that was passed in 2018, which says that, you know, if there's an official presence of the PLO on U.S. territory, that will trigger previously dismissed civil cases that for $650 million that were against the PLO and PA for political violence dating back to the Second Intifada. Those cases were dismissed, but they will be reactivated if a PLO or PA official steps foot on U.S. soil. So So they're not going to be coming back anytime soon, even if Biden invites them to come back, which he can do under his executive powers. But you know, it would entail such a financial liability for the PLO and PA that they wouldn't do it.
Barbara asks, what global institution can hold Israel accountable for ethnic cleansing, apartheid, racism, annexation of land? And I think you've touched on it already with the various bodies, but I also put the media in there. I feel the media has not done a good enough job in looking at these issues. And quite clearly, there's a Western media bias. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yes, well, as Zaha said, the institutions are there, and they've the ICC was a brilliant moment, and it had the ICJ was a brilliant moment. It had done its job, and we would have saved so much suffering and been so much further along if that decision had been taken and taken around the world, and especially in Europe, which really cares about the rule of law. We could have stopped at that time settler goods from coming in and so on. But now, I hope I'm a bit more optimistic than Zaha. I hope the ICC goes somewhere. I hope that we're better organized in terms of getting the International Criminal Court to hold Israel accountable, and the crimes that it's supposed to be investigating, you can see them every day, taking place every day. So it doesn't have to look far. I mean, obviously, it's not looking at this time slot, but it's really. You know, you don't have to work very hard to make your case, but you do have to be extremely persistent to see it driven through. I think there's a shift in the media. I think whether people like it or not, the Human Rights Watch, because it's such a respected institution, highly respected in the United States, and including amongst American Jews, they have to take it seriously. They can't say, oh, well, you know, the Human Rights Watch was great until now, but now it's a piece of trash. No, I mean, they have to.
They're all saying that, though.
Yeah, well, but it's not sticking, I don't think. I mean, the report is excellent and very well documented and very hard to I think, brush under the rug. And so you have these kinds of organizations that can hold Israel accountable. And this, by the way, it isn't a standalone report. It comes after the B'Tselem report earlier this year, which also found Israel guilty of apartheid on both sides of the Green Line. And that's a big thing for B'Tselem to say in a conclusion to come to. And again, very well studied and very well documented. And you had the report 4 years ago by Richard Falk and Virginia Tilley that was published by the UN Economic Social Commission of Western Asia, ESCWA, which was then pulled almost immediately. It was published, but it's still out there for anyone who wants to read it. And that applied the ruling, or that applied the finding of apartheid to all parts of the Palestinian people, including the diaspora, was suffering from Israeli practices of apartheid. And it's interesting that the Human Rights Watch also mentions the Palestinian exiles and refugees, the diaspora, in its report. So these things will create change, and the Palestinians aren't going anywhere. And despite all the horrendous attacks and all the loss of life and the loss of life on both sides, I don't like that term, both sides, but there is loss of life and it's tragic. And we could avoid all that by reaching a settlement that recognizes Palestinian rights in and rights to Palestine alongside Israel, or a single state of Palestinians and Israelis of full human rights.
Kieran?
Now, I was going to just ask Zaha if she felt that here in America there is a change with the media coverage, or is the language still arguably the same when you look at the New York Times or when you look at the Washington Post? Has anything changed in the last maybe few years?
I think there has been quite a bit of change, especially I would say on the op-ed pages. Like, you're seeing much more Palestinian voices represented, and you're also seeing, I think, more nuanced reporting, though it's still very much in an Israeli-centric sort of frame. But just today, if you looked at Ishan Tharoor's Washington Post and how he talked about what's taking place, I mean, I could have wrote that. I mean, he's a much better writer. But in terms of like the framing and the context and all of that was there. Like, the context is always missing when you're talking about Palestine, Israel on the pages of a newspaper. And in fact, I was just watching CNN earlier, and I'm finally seeing them cover what's going on, and they're covering it with video, because rockets were fired from Gaza into Israel and into Jerusalem. So that's where reporting starts. Reporting starts when it's impacting Israeli lives, when there's an Israeli casualty. That's when reporting starts. It doesn't start with there's an occupation, there's apartheid, there's repression and oppression of Palestinians, and then all these series of events happens. No, it always starts, especially on TV news, at the point in which it impacts Israelis, Israeli lives. And so, you are starting to see, because we have more opportunities to engage, because everyone's got a cell phone, everyone's recording what's happening, and everyone's uploading to social media. I feel that newspapers and online periodicals have more material now to work with, and they can't ignore. If they want to compete with the social media, they have to take account of what's being uploaded by individuals who are bearing witness to what's happening on the ground. So definitely there's been a change, but it's not fast enough to keep up with the damage that's being done on the ground. Yeah. And there really needs to, this Human Rights Watch report, I think, is really important for that reason too. I think it's going to accelerate the debates and the discussions and the way people report, because that's what's missing. It's this understanding the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians is not like two equal sides, two parties that have equal claims. No, this is an apartheid situation. It's not a conflict. It's not clashes that are just moments in time. It's a historical relationship that involves the domination of one group by another, and we need to start centering that in the way we talk about Israel and Palestine.
I don't know whether you saw this morning, but Haaretz carried a story about Ron Dermer, the former Israeli ambassador to Washington, who is basically saying that Israel should wash its hands of the Jews because they're far too liberal and pro-Palestinian. They should concentrate on the evangelicals.
Yes.
That's right.
So in a sense, that's a sort of testament of the change, the real change that's taken place here over the last 10 or 20 years.
Yeah. I mean, I think they've had such an easy ride, Israel under Netanyahu, that they think they can get away with anything, like sending clearly racist ambassadors to places like Britain and so on. But I want to build on what Zaha said about the media, and in response to your concerns, Kieran, which is to give a shout out, as they say, to the piece by Nathan Thrall in the New Yorker, A Day in the Life of Abid Salama, which is one of the most gripping and heartrending and forensic accounts of what has happened to Palestine and Palestinians. And I recommend it to everyone. It's difficult reading because it's so forensic, and it merges the human story with the entire history of what's been done. But I think it's a must read for anyone who wants to follow and understand what's going on in Palestine. It's a real tour de force.
I've got to get a PSA. Zaha was mentioning about Ishan Tharoor being a great writer. He got it from his dad, who we have on in 3 weeks' time, talking about India. Shashi Tharoor will be a future guest on this one, which should be, it will certainly be eloquent and entertaining, as well as informative. But we are getting towards the end now. So Nadia, do you want to sum up the discussion and what you think the point of this report? What do you hope to see from this report?
I think I really would like to see the diaspora read it and have more agency. And I would like to see the diplomatic corps also read it and say, okay, where can we go from here? What can we do? And we're beginning to do some outreach to various Palestinian communities, and we've done outreach, thanks to Zaha, to several groups in the Palestinian American groups in the United States, and they were extremely responsive about wanting this report presented to them, having a discussion about it, first with a small group of about 70 people, and then with a larger group of members. And so without giving anyone the impression that we are organizing a revival of the PLO ourselves. No, we don't want to give that impression. We do want to make this information accessible. I recommend the report to everyone. And also, if you have not signed up on the Shabaka's email list, I do recommend that you sign up to get the information. There was a question, sorry, in the chat box, Ian, asking for the name of the article again that I mentioned, and it's by Nathan Thrall, Thrall, and the name of the piece, or the title of the piece, is A Day in the Life of Abid Salama. A Day in the Life of Abid Salama.
Okay, so okay, thank you very much, Zaha. Thank you very much, Nadia. Thanks very much, my colleague Kieran.
You cannot keep me down. I won't fall to the ground. I'll struggle on for 10 long years. I'm out the other side crystal clear. I'm made from the same